So thank you very much for coming. 30 years ago, nearly to this very day, I walked up Marquand Chapel steps to receive my diploma from Dean Keck. And if you had asked me then if I would ever come back here and deliver a lecture to students who may have read my book, I would have said impossible. So it's a really delightful occasion, so I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here. I could talk for a very long time about food and faith and the theology of eating, but I want to start by acknowledging that we are in an unprecedented moment in the history of humanity. And this moment is the one in which never before have so few people understood where their food comes from. Okay, this is a really novel situation for people to be in, because historically almost everybody was involved practically and daily in the production of their own food, whether as hunter-gatherers or as farmers or as peasants or what have you. But we are in the signal position of having to figure out through journalism where our food comes from, because we do not have a direct hand in it. This is new in the history of the world. And we have to figure out, what does it mean for us as eaters who have to eat? What does it mean for us as human beings? How we think about ourselves, how we think about our world, how we think about our life with other creatures, that we know so little about food. The shopping relationship to food is the most naive relationship to the world that is possible. And yet, for many of us, that's exactly the relationship that we have. And the proof would be if I said to you, okay, you can't go to the grocery store anymore. Here's some seed, here's some land. What would you do? I would probably starve. And, you know, I keep a garden and I raise some things, but for me, there's always the knowledge that if my tomatoes don't grow this year, I can go to the store. I can go to the farmer's market. There is no pressure. What if we didn't have that kind of experience with the world, where our knowing things about the world, our having the skills necessary to provide for our own sustenance? What if we lived in a world where those skills were so essential that if we didn't have them, we would starve? This is a new situation for us, to be the consumers who can live so easily and so conveniently in the world. And I would also then say, so superficially in the world. And it's made even more dramatic, I think, because we're now moving to a stage where we're no longer just going to grocery stores to buy our food. We're facing the possibility of doing most of our food shopping online. Which means you can be in your pajamas, on your couch, in your bed, wherever, and just on your iPad or laptop, just be scrolling through all the beautiful pictures of food that will be presented to you, and this food will be delivered to your door. And then someone will open the door and put it in your fridge for you, and then someone will put it in the oven for you, and then someone will probably put it in your mouth for you. Right? What's the characterization of people that's at work in this way of procuring and consuming food? I think questions of our humanity are at the center of this sort of a conversation. We have ceased to be the growers, the nurturers of the food that sustain us, to becoming the spectators and the shoppers of food. And I want us to ask, just for a little bit, what happens to the way we think about the world when we think about food primarily as a product or as a commodity that shows up on a shelf in a store or on a screen on our laptop? And I think what we have to attend to right off is that this becomes a description of the world in which everything is reducible to a commodity. And as a commodity, it is now going to be susceptible to certain kinds of logics that will govern its production and consumption. And I think one of the things that's very clear is that we have a food system now which reduces food to commodities, and us as consumers who now have a desire to have food in basically three important ways: cheaply, conveniently, and in copious supply. We want to have a lot of it. We don't want to have to pay very much for it. And we don't want to have to do much with it when we get it. Right? So you go into grocery stores and you will discover that it's not just whole foods that you have in the grocery stores. So many of the foods available now in grocery stores are packaged, prepared, so that when you come home, the most you have to do is put them in a microwave for 3 minutes roughly, and you can eat. We have to attend to how this commodification is working itself out in the world in all sorts of destructive ways. Because I think if you know that cheapness is one of the primary drivers of the food system that we have, that's going to affect the kind of farming practices that we have. Because if you're going to have, Julia preached this morning, I don't know if you had a chance to hear it, she preached about chickens this morning in the chapel service. If you're going to have really cheap chicken meat, and Americans like cheap chicken meat, you're going to have to torture chickens. That's being dramatic, okay? But it's going to mean that we're not going to respect what Joel Salatin calls the chickenness of the chicken. And you might say, well, what in the world is that about, the chickenness of the chicken? Well, think about this from the perspective of commodity. Think about this from the perspective of unit of production, where we want to maximize units of production, because when we do that, we do the kind of production system that maximizes flow, reducing cost, and that's a benefit to us as the consumers. So place yourself in the position of the chicken producer. If you know that it takes roughly, what, 10 weeks, we'll say, maybe 11 or 12, to raise a chicken from chick to slaughter weight. You realize then that you've got, what, 4, maybe 5 cycles that you can run in the year at your farm. What if you could cut that in half by doing some genetic modification of chickens so that they grow more quickly? And since we like white meat in particular in this country, what if we could design the chicken in such a way that the chicken has a lot of breast meat? And then what if you said, wait a minute, when we do chicken processing, we have to defeather them. What if we were to genetically design a chicken that is without feathers? I've seen this picture, by the way. It is the saddest looking chicken you have ever seen. It's a chicken embarrassed to be a chicken. But from the point of view of commodity, or from the point of view of units of production, producing chickens in this way is not just acceptable, it's a boon to consumers who want to have chicken meat as cheaply as possible. Right? And we're doing this across the field. We're doing this with all of the various animals in different ways. We're doing this with our land, where we treat soil primarily as a unit of production, and we mine the soil of its fertility to maximize the growth of our crops. We're doing this with agricultural workers. How many of you know how we get such cheap strawberries? How are the people who are raising and then harvesting those strawberries, how are they being treated? Many of us don't know, because our food comes to us from behind this massive veil of ignorance. And when you add to that a global, anonymous economy in which so much of our food now circulates, if I were to ask you where the food you are eating comes from, you would have a hard time. And I do this with my students. I ask them in a food class that I teach, pick some snack food that you really like, and then do the analysis to figure out how that snack product that you love came to the shelf that you then purchase. And the answers that students come back with is, do you know how hard it was to find out? You know, there's a customer service number on the package oftentimes. Call it sometime. See where that takes you. If you reach a human being, they're going to say, we don't know. So it's not just that there is this big blanket that separates us from the sources of our food, but there's also an industry that in many instances doesn't want you to know. It's very difficult as a consumer for you to know these things. So if you're in that kind of a context, you can't possibly know if there is good care being exhibited in this food or bad care. And when we think about how so much of our food comes to us in ways that no longer resemble what your grandparents might have thought food to be, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of damage and there's a lot of abuse. And it's working itself out in our own diets. Human beings, through time and across cultures, have eaten many different kinds of diets. And many of them are more or less healthy. But there's one diet that we know is uniformly unhealthy. And guess which one it is? Right? It's today's industrial diet, which is so highly processed, so highly worked through all sorts of artificial techniques and then synthetic enhancements. And why are we doing this? It's a good question. But what we know is happening is that its effects are being worked out in our own bodies in the varying forms of disease, in the varying forms of problems that we are having that are now becoming major public health crises that we're having to pay an enormous cost to try to address. What I think happens in a system where we're talking about the commodification of food, the reduction of the elements of food to something like units of production, what is being violated is the integrity and sanctity of life. And I know when I bring this up among some people, the first response is, well, come on, it's just a chicken, right? Why should we worry that we're doing these things to chickens so that they will grow faster and grow bigger? So what I say is, well, let's do this same technique on our children. I have 4 children. They're all athletes. So I'm thinking as a parent, I'm going to have to feed these kids for 18 years. That's expensive. And they're runners, right? So they eat a lot. So from a cost-effective point of view, what I should do as a parent is I should go to my medical engineers and I should say to them, can we genetically design kids so that they get to adult size by the time of 9 or 10? How many would you be all right with that? What's wrong with it? I think the answer is fairly obvious. It's a violation of the integrity of this life form. There's a reason why it takes 18 rough years for children to grow into adulthood. Why should we think it's any different for the other life forms of this world? Shouldn't we respect the integrity of these animals so that when we see them, we first of all attend to their particularity, understand how there are life forms that are unique to it, that we should honor in our raising of them? And of course, this is not what we do, because we have reduced things to being units of production. And we do this not just with animals, we do this with plants, we do this with animals. We do this with our land itself. What does a land need to be fertile and healthy? That's a question that rarely gets broached because we're so intent on seeing the land as a facility for the production of commodities that we have deemed important. I talk to plant biologists, engineers at different state universities, and I'll say to them, when's the last time you designed a plant with flavor or nutrition in mind? And they'll say, well, that's a really hard sell because we have to design plants to deal with the kinds of herbicides we want to use, herbicide resistance, or we're designing the plants for a long transport life and then a long shelf life. And so flavor isn't the primary desideratum when we even grow our plants, because we're thinking about plants not in terms of the nutritional quality they can provide. We're thinking about plants as stems upon which to grow the foods that can be marketed in particular sorts of ways. Is this a violation of plant life? I would argue that we could speak in this sort of a way. So if we were to go into the varying sectors, the varying dimensions of the food system that provides food for us, I would argue that in so many places we're finding violation of the sanctity of life. And it's a violation that in the end gets worked out on all of us as the eaters of this food. Because when we produce this kind of food where we have degraded soil, plants, and animals and agricultural workers, do you think it will be any different in the way we treat the eaters? That from the food system point of view, the only thing that matters about you is not your own health. It's not about whether or not you're enjoying the flavor of the food. It's about whether you're going to pay the money to enrich the system. And as eaters, I would think we should have the power to say no to something like this. That we should recognize that we have an obligation to think about the quality of the system and the sanctity of the life that is constantly circulating through it. So we can have the framing, as we do, of food as a commodity. And I'll stop with that sort of critique side of things now and move to what would be a theological way to think about food. If it's not a commodity that's subject to the logics of efficiency or the logic of profitability or the logic of cheapness and convenience, what would be a better way? I want you to think about food as the gift of God's love. And I want you to think about food as God's love made nutritious, even God's love made delicious. And some of you are saying, that is a very strange way of speaking. But I think this is the direction we need to go and should go on theological grounds. Because if you read Scripture, you discover that food is first and foremost a gift of God given to creatures for the furtherance of their own life. And this is one of the reasons why God gets really angry when there's hunger in the land. Because hunger signifies the lack of nurture. And God is above all the one who nurtures. And so God is presented to us in Scripture as the provider of the gifts of food. Many other gifts too, but that's fundamental. And people who have lived on close terms with hunger, unlike many of us, this is important to register. That one of the first ways that God communicates God's presence in the world to us is through the nurture that food is. Now, saying that food is God's love made nutritious sounds a little bit far-fetched, but if you ask theologians, why does God create? The best answer we've been able to come up with is because God loves. That the creation of the world is a material, manifestation of the exuberance of God's love that desires for others to be. And so God's first work of creation is the work of hospitality, in which God makes room within God's perfect life for another to appear and be welcomed and then nurtured and then liberated into the fullness of its life. This is a vision that sustains what I would consider to be the sanctity of life. The sanctity of life is not a possession. It's the giftedness of God working itself out in creaturely life. Now you're going to say, okay, food is God's love made delicious. That sounds really nice and mushy. Who's going to reject love? We do. But then we have to add that there is this complication. And it's hard for us to appreciate this complication because, as I said at the start, we've been reduced to being the consumers of food, the shoppers of food. So we don't have very close experience with the actual growing or the raising of food. The love that is made nutritious in food is a very costly love. Because for any creature to eat, others have to die. And this is a really sobering reality for us to deal with. And there's good reason, I think, why the great religious traditions of the world have spent a great deal of time thinking about food as a matter of faith. It's certainly evident within the traditions of Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, but somehow Christians as of late have decided that food isn't really that important an issue. And I think part of it is that so many Christians are really walking around in a Gnostic guise. where they don't believe that bodies are really that important to God. And I think we need to learn to resist this Gnostic temptation and discover how in the world God is present in the life within the flesh of the world. And when we think about how the flesh of this world in its plant animal forms requires eating, we now have to figure out, how do we manage to make ourselves worthy of the flesh that we are going to eat? This, I think, is going to be one of the major, major questions. And in our panel conversation just before this, Willie made this very good point, that we have to listen to the life that we are first going to eat. Because perhaps we're not worthy of the food that we eat. So let's think a little bit about what we might do to better position ourselves to receive food, not as a commodity, but as a gift of God's love. What might we start to do? Well, I think first of all, we're going to have to learn to recover what I've called a sacrificial sensibility. And I know this is very, very difficult to talk about because the logic of sacrifice or the grammar of sacrifice has been used in all sorts of ways to do a lot of harm. And of course, I would argue that in doing so, it has done also a violation of what the sacrificial sensibility is fundamentally about. And this is what I think it is. Developing a sacrificial sensibility is about learning to offer yourself to God by offering yourself to the world. That's what it's fundamentally about. And I think what we can do to unpack this just a little bit, because I know we don't have a lot of time, is think for a minute about why did the Israelites practice sacrifice? Why do so many of the religious traditions of the world speak about sacrifice? And I think what you have to understand is that in the sacrifice of the food, it wasn't just animals, but the sacrifice of the food that the Israelites were asked to bring to God, they were being asked to do two things. One, they were being taught to learn not to hang on to life as a possession. Right? That it's something that had to be given up to God as a testament of our having received gratefully and humbly the gifts that always come from God. Right? So that's a very important part of it, learning not to grasp life. And the second one is, in the sacrifice, you are not ever bringing simply the gift of the animal or the grain. You're bringing the gift of your own labor and love. And again, this is really difficult for people within a consumer society to appreciate, but you have to think about the Israelite experience. These are people who are living subsistence agriculture. They don't have a great abundance of extra livestock just hanging around. So when they gave of their livestock, they gave of their livelihood. And they were instructed, as you may recall, not to bring the animal that was about to die anyway. They were asked to bring the animal that was without blemish. And they weren't asked to bring the grain that was the leftovers. They were asked to bring the first fruits as a sign of their trust in God. And so they brought to this altar not just the food, but the gift of all the labor and care that was required to keep this animal alive and also to keep the crops going. This was the crucial element in the sacrificial moment. And we know this because when the prophets later denounce the sacrifice of the Israelites, the reason they denounce it is not because they want to say the sacrificial attitude is over. What they're criticizing is people who are simply coming to the city, purchasing an animal and bringing it up to an altar, which meant that they were not bringing any of the life of care that preceded the animal even being there. So when God asks for sacrifice, it's not because God is bloodthirsty and loves to see animals be destroyed. God asks for sacrifice because God wants us, as the ones living in a world which is very costly, to learn how to give ourselves in nurture to the world that nurtures us. This becomes the fundamental sort of experience that needs to be cultivated in humanity. Because insofar as people learn to presume upon the world, to simply take the world, we violate the very structures of life. And we see this when we think also about Christians. The Apostle Paul says in Romans, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Right? What does that mean? What does it mean to make your body into a living sacrifice? I think the point is, it's not about self-immolation. It's about this practice of self-offering. Learning to make your body the site through which love and care of others becomes a possibility. And so when we think about the Eucharist as a sacrificial meal, we don't come to the meal like this, to grasp and to take and to own. We come to the Eucharist with our hands open to receive, so that we will then also share, and then in the sharing lift up to God the gift that is God's from the very beginning. Now, what does this look like practically speaking? Let's come back to chickens. My grandfather farmed with us and has in many ways been very much the model of in my mind about what it means to care for the creatures that nurture us. At our farm, we had chickens, and every lunchtime after we ate, my grandfather would grab a scythe and a bucket, and he would go mow down some grass somewhere on the farm property. And he would come back to the chicken coop, and the chickens would see him, and they would come running, and they would be smiling. Dale, chickens can smile, right? They can. They were happy. Because my grandfather would throw the grass in the air, and the chickens would just jump for joy and eat the grass. Now, I look at this now, and I think, that was just a dumb thing to do. Because these chickens were free range. They could get whatever chicken food they wanted. They could go anywhere on the farm. We didn't know to call them free range back then. It's just what you did. But my grandfather believed that these chickens were gifts from God. And he knew that by giving them grass, he made the chickens happy. He knew that he respected the lives of those chickens enough to give of his own effort, his own time, to secure their happiness in this very small way. And this very generous, joyful action, a ritual really, then carried over into the care of all the animals that were on our farm, and then also into the care of the plants and the ground itself. How he moved amongst the fields and how he moved amongst the animals communicated repeatedly that he's in the presence of gifts, that if he's going to receive them as the source of his own nurture, he must commit his life to being a source of nurture to them. This agriculture that I'm describing is not nostalgic, it's not impossible. It's the experience of farmers all across the world, where the relationship between the farmer and their place, the farmer and the plants, and the farmer and the animals, is a relationship motivated by affection, motivated by the sensibility that fundamentally what we're dealing with is a sacred gift that exceeds all comprehension. Eating is not a simple thing. Eating is really a terrifying mystery that gets to the core of what it is to be a human being, because you could imagine that God would have created a world in which we didn't have to eat. You can imagine that possibility, I think. But this is not what God chose to do. God chose to create a world in which eating is the medium of life and love, so that food becomes our entrance into the life of fellowship, insofar as our movements are inspired by something like the love of others and the love of God. When we don't have food register in our minds as a sacred gift, we're going to do a lot of damage in the world. And I believe this sincerely because when you look at how the food that we now produce, we're producing more calories than the world has ever seen before. But these are calories that are often presented to people in ways that show utter disregard and disrespect for life. Utter disregard for the places of our lives. And I think people are recognizing that the food that is presented to them is not honoring of life, and so they feel themselves to have been demeaned by the experience of receiving this food. Our bodies are revolting more and more against the food that is being presented to us. It's not news to you, I don't think, that people are developing more allergies and reactions to food than ever before. What if we were to imagine that food, the action of eating, is a moment of sacred encounter? I think what people want in this world is to come into the sort of experience in which the very medium and movement of our lives communicates something more than simply somebody else's maximization of us. Some utilitarian or technocratic cog in a big, big machine that serves ends that have very little to do with our flourishing or the flourishing of what we love. I think food systems can be the point through which something like that sacred encounter can happen. But for it to happen, we need to be committed as eaters to being the sort of folk who value and therefore support the kind of agriculture that is steeped in care and respect of the life that is going to feed us. There's lots of ways we can do that as consumers. I don't expect many of you are going to go out and get chickens or purchase a cow or something of that sort. But one of the things that you all can do is grow one plant. I do this with students also, just to find out what people will learn by having the task of taking care of another life form. Sometimes the students will become a little bit more adventuresome and they'll say, I'm going to try to grow one tomato plant. That's a big job, folks. And the first thing they discover how easy it is to kill it because of negligence. But every once in a while, a student is successful in growing the tomato plant and they get to harvest a vine-ripe tomato and they eat it. And it's not just a flavor explosion in the head when that happens. It's also an experience that ties the human being who devoted their care. And one tomato plant, it's not a lot of work, but it's some. Imagine having to do this on a much larger scale. One of the reasons I think people are struggling so much with issues of embodiment today, with issues of identity today, is that we find ourselves in a world that has been completely desacralized. It's been desecrated. What if we were to say that we're going to stop the desecration of bodies, of all the bodies, by first of all committing to the nurture of all the bodies? That would be a different agricultural system. It would be a different food system. And I think there's every reason in the world why faith communities can be taking the lead in this. Because I do believe, and we can have conversation about this now, that what people want to know is that what they put in their bodies in the form of food is more than just a product. They want to know that their bodies are more than simply being receptacles for the profit maximization of some corporation. Do you realize that your bodies are being viewed by the next wave of the food industry as simply a site through which to pass through food? So it won't even be food that can be digestible? Because as you know, I think you know, a human being can only eat so much food. And then you reach saturation or you're full. So the long-term dream of food producers is to develop a food product which isn't actually digested by you, so that your body rejects it, because then you can eat an infinite quantity of it. Think about the profit potential in that. Now, I know that's a scary scenario, but we've got engineers who are hard at work on developing these kinds of foods. Because what we're interested in is not the sanctity of bodies, the sacred character of the world in which we live. So that was a really gloomy note to end on. I wasn't planning that. But I think the choice is very clear. We have to figure out, are we going to think about food as a commodity, or are we going to think about it as a sacred gift, especially as the gift of God's love? I hope you'll choose the latter. Thank you.
So we do have a little bit of time for questions. I'm going to ask you, I'll call on you, I'll let Norman stand here at the mic. Would you just stand, tell us who you are, and pose your questions so that people can hear? Don't be afraid to project a little. So the floor is open. You can ask about this lecture, you can ask about the book. Yes.
Idea of the food war, science of taking it on me, like cigarette and use to high
Yeah, so that's the question is, would it be good to put packaging on our labeling on our packaging describing how some of the foods that we eat, like certain kinds of meats, contribute to certain diseases and so forth? Yes. Yeah, I am for packaging labeling. Now, it gets very contentious very, very quickly. And here's why. Because medical community is not in agreement about some of these things. So I would be a little more cautious about the health effects of particular foods for people, because the health effects are not uniform and we don't always know exactly. So for instance, several years ago, the idea was you never eat butter. Butter is the devil, and we go to margarine. And I think the thinking on that has now been changed. There used to be thinking that all red meat is just awful. And then we started to realize that, well, wait a minute, pasture-raised beef, which honors a cow by giving a cow grass to eat, actually produces meat that has amino acid structures in it that are actually good for cardiovascular health. So there's a lot of contention around health effects. So I would be in favor of labeling that is not so much about that, but about the context in which the food is being produced. Right? So if you're going to purchase eggs, then on the package it says something about the facility in which those eggs were produced. Or if you're going to raise or purchase flour, what kinds of fields were this flour being produced from, right? I think those would be ways that I think people could get a better sense of how to evaluate the food that's being presented to them in a store. Not everyone's going to know what to do with the labels. I mean, one of the reasons that labeling is so contentious is that if you go into a grocery store now, there's all kinds of labels. It's not very well regulated. And you can just know that if it says all natural, it's not natural. So there's a lot of deception, because we know that by what we put on packages, we can increase its salability. And so there's a lot of fighting about what you get to put on. And right now, there isn't a lot of accountability for the labeling that goes on.
My name is Ben. I'm a first year philosophy of religion concentration. Obviously, this is a theology of eating, so there's a lot of religious commitments involved in arguing for the sanctity of life, etc. How would the argument be translatable to an audience that does not share the same kind of religious commitment?
Yeah, so I talk often to farming groups where I cannot at all assume something like a theological commitment. And so I talk more generally about the sacred. And I can do this because there are so many traditions that speak this way. So I'll just give you one example about this. One of the people that I love very much is this woman named Robin Kimmerer. She's an indigenous scholar, botanist, and she teaches botany to college students. And she wrote this fabulous book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which you should read. And in it, she says that in the Western world in particular, there's something like a mass psychosis that is going on because people feel the world in which they live as not the place of love. And she says the analogy you might use is imagine growing up in a household where you did not feel loved. What kind of personality comes out of a home where the person raised in it does not feel love? And we can see this in lots of ways, right? The person is deeply damaged psychically and will do all kinds of compensatory strategies to suggest to others and to themselves that they really matter. And so we do these incredibly stupid things to inflate ourselves and our own importance because we're insecure in the knowledge that we matter. And what Robin Kimmerer says, that's just a household. Now imagine that you believe the whole world is a place where there's no love. And she says, indigenous folks who respect plant and animal life, who offer themselves in a kind of moral relationship to the plants and animals and places, by doing this, they give their love to a land that then shows love back. And that's an experience that when I talk about this with farmers and gardeners, some of them start weeping. Because they say, as I have worked in the soil, or as I have worked with my chickens, I'm dealing with things I can't comprehend. And I use the language of love, but I'm embarrassed to say this. Because when you talk about this with people who don't have any connection, any meaningful, practical connection with land or with plants or with animals, they think you're goofy. But they say this is an experience that's very real. And they say they wish that the people who bought their food understood that. Because they then end up saying it's a sacred connection to the world. And when we become simply the purchasers of food, the shoppers of food, we don't have access to that kind of experience. And our lives are deeply impoverished by that. Because we believe the world to be basically what? One big shopping mall. Or a big mine. And that's not a good place to be.
Hi, I'm Emily Amanda here. To kind of build upon that question, I was really struck what you talked about relationship of affection. And how something that doesn't make sense to me is companion animals. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. Is that really an outgrowth of this ownership kind of culture? Or is this some kind of anomaly of us trying to express love for animals that we have kind of sublimated elsewhere in our culture?
Yeah, and I don't know if I can say that it's a uniform thing. Different people think about their pets in different sorts of ways. For some, it's very clear that the pet is a creature with whom one has a pretty intense, affectionate, loving relationship, so much so that their death or their sickness or illness is understood as a major personal catastrophe, more so than the death of a family member, right? We know that that happens. There's also, I think, something else going on here, which is that now pet culture has become this highly industrialized system. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and people spend thousands of dollars on therapy for their pet animals, and I don't know what to say about all that. I mean, I think it's a good thing that people want to have pets, but I also want to acknowledge that in some ways the pet relationship is a distorting relationship with animals. People have lived with animals for a very, very long time. And what I would worry about is that in treating the animals or treating all animals as a kind of pet, we don't respect the integrity of different kinds of creatures. And I would say that's a very important thing to maintain. There's a danger of anthropomorphizing the animals that we live with. And the sort of joke around all this is if you're on a farm, if you name the animals, you can't eat them anymore. So what you do is you don't name them, or if you're going to name them, you name them, steak or barbecue or something like that. Because to name them in this sort of personal way makes it much more difficult to eat them. So the relationships that we have with our animals, they're various, they're important, but I don't know that all of them are healthy. I think you'd have to take it case by case.
Take one more question. Arthur?
I was wondering, can we address reframing the narratives of how we understand eating?
I'm sorry, can you speak a little louder?
Can we address reframing the narratives of how we understand food that fits into eating, this ideology that we are moving towards, without first addressing the pathology that causes the psychosis that you referred to, which leaves us with the ideology of consumption? So I'm wondering if in your speeches and in your workshops or conferences, is there sort of like a simultaneous address? Like, listen, we need to go towards this ideology and understanding. We need to shift the narrative symbols of language that form these sort of ideas about what we think about food. But in order to do this, we must realize what we currently are and what has fueled this psychosis that sort of perpetuates this consumption of doubt that we're living in. So can you do one without the other?
Yeah. No, that's a brilliant question, and I think you're absolutely spot on. So one of the things I talk about often is the need for human beings to switch the register in which we are quite happy to be the consumers of everything, and instead learn to become participants in the production of the things we need for livelihood. And there are lots of ways to do this. It's not just around food. Right? It's also about basic things like construction, repair, building things, making things, clothing, all these sorts of things. And the reasons are very, very important. One of them is that if you become a producer, you suddenly have to engage the world in a fundamentally new way. One, you have to know something. As a shopper of food, you can be an idiot. All you need is a credit card. You can be stupid, you can be morally debased, but if you got a credit card, you get it. But if you're a producer, if you're stupid, you die. It's a very, very important distinction. So I'm constantly talking to people about how can you involve yourself in the production of the sources of your own livelihood. Right? And so I would argue that there's a tremendously important educational side of this where we take university culture, which is basically a training to be better consumers, and instead try to figure out how do we make university education the kind of education where we're actually involving people in the production of the sources of livelihood. Because for one thing, let's stick with food since we're talking about food. If you say, I want to grow some food, you have to know some things about soil. You have to know some things about plants. What do the diseases that come to plants, when do they come? How do they come? How do we treat them so as not to destroy the life? So for instance, I'll give you a silly example. I grew up farming, but I didn't grow a lot of strawberries. I didn't know much about strawberries. We didn't grow them. So when I had my first house, I had 2 little girls. I said, I want to grow our own strawberries because my girls will think I'm a super duper dad. So I go with my girls, we go to the store, we buy the strawberry plants, we made our bed, and we're watering them, and we're having such a great time, and we're watching the berries grow, and they start green, then they get pink, and then they're getting red, and I say, Emily and Anna, guess what? 2 days we get to go pick the strawberries. So what happens? 2 days later, we go out there to pick strawberries. Guess what's happened? Ants and slugs are eating all the strawberries. Because God makes a smart world. The critters, they know when the food's good. They come and eat, right? So I am not just humiliated. My girls are looking at me, okay, now what, Dad? But then I discover that I'm angry because I'm saying, by what right do those slugs get to eat my strawberries, right? So like any self-respecting dad, what did I do? I went to Walmart. Because at Walmart, they got pest management solutions. And they're in green bottles. So I came home, and in very unmanly fashion, I read the directions. And it said, basically, don't let any pets near the sprayed area, don't let any children near the sprayed area, and burn any clothing that comes in direct contact with this solution. And I said, I'm going to spray this on my strawberries, and then we're going to eat them? I'm going to feed them to my kids? So when you go to the grocery store and you see those really big strawberries and there isn't a single blemish on them, you now need to know how that happened. Because we've made that strawberry first something that no other creature will want to eat, or that if it tried to eat it, it would die. And we want to eat that. Now, we don't know any of that unless we're actually trying to grow our own strawberries. And you have to then figure out, what do I do with ants and slugs? So the next thing I did after I went to Walmart, I did the next thing any good man does. I called my mama. I said, Mama, what do I do? Because she grew all this food all these years of my life. And she says, well, Norman, don't be so stupid. It's very simple. Take the lid and put beer in it and put it on the ground, and the slug will go and drink the beer and die. And if you're a slug, what's a better way to go, right? And the other thing is you take vinegar and you put it in a water bottle and you spray vinegar water on your strawberries, and the ants will stay away because they hate it. And the vinegar won't hurt you at all. But it means you got to be smart. And this, of course, is why I get so angry with the caricature of farmers as simpletons. They have the most complex intelligence, complex set of affections and sympathies, because they're not just taking care of strawberries, they're taking care of all kinds of plants, and then all the animals, and they got to know all that stuff. But by knowing all that stuff, they know how to live more humbly and more gratefully in the world. And that's why I think farmers need to be on campuses teaching us this stuff. Because when we're just shoppers, we don't know much. So great question.